So again, it's my pleasure to be here. Congratulations again to Don. I was asked to come and give a presentation on cybersecurity and rights and liberties. Before I get into that, I'll give you a little bit of my background so that you get a sense of where I'm coming from in this space and how I think about the issue in general, and then we can go into a little more detail. And you're going to get a lot of me today because I guess I'm staying for the panel afterwards as well. So you have plenty of time to ask me questions and go into a lot more detail if we want to do that. I started in this space at the Center for Democracy and Technology. I was there for 12 years, and I worked on privacy issues and security issues while I was there. I helped to develop a group called the Anti-Spyware Coalition that ended up with a very successful effort in defining what malware was at the time in 2004 and moving forward from there. And based on that work, I ended up getting to know the folks at the National Institute of Standards and Technology very well. And when the new administration came in, there was a movement at the Department of Commerce where NIST is located to build an Internet Policy Task Force. And that Internet Policy Task Force did things like privacy and cybersecurity. And they brought me on to be the NIST representative to that group. Through that work, and I started there 5 years ago, and a little over 5 years ago, and through that work, I ended up being detailed to the Secretary's office. In 2 years in the Secretary's office, we had 6 secretaries, so it was a little bit of a tumultuous time at the Department of Commerce. But in that process, I was able to work a lot and build a really firm grasp on the cybersecurity issues throughout the government, working with the private sector very closely. We put together a legislative package at that time in 2011 from the administration on how to address cybersecurity issues. And one of the pieces of that was building standards for cybersecurity. In that discussion on building standards, when this came into the Senate in particular, there was a movement to try to figure out how to do this in a voluntary way, since it was unlikely we were going to pass any regulatory standards on critical infrastructure at that time, and probably still today. So the effort, in a lot of ways, shifted to being a discussion about how much more we could do through executive order in a voluntary way when it became clear that legislation in that space was not going to pass. That led a lot of people back to the National Institute of Standards and Technology and to build what was then called the Cybersecurity Framework. Through that work, I became very involved with the National Security Council, and they brought me on to the White House to work on a range of network defense issues. Privacy originally first and foremost, but then expanding into areas including critical infrastructure protection, federal government protection, and information sharing and promoting information sharing. And I'm going to talk about the range of those issues today. But first I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about the word cyber and cybersecurity. When I first came in the government 5 years ago, I don't know if you can read that fully, but those of you that can't, there's you can go to XKCD and look up their cyber intelligence piece online. But when I came to the government 5 years ago, I was not a fan of the word cyber or cybersecurity. And I was going to think of subtitling this presentation, How I Stopped Hating and Learned to Love the Word Cyber. But maybe I should, but then I was thinking maybe it would be more appropriate to be How I Learned to Stop Hating and Became Ambivalent About the Word Cyber instead. And I want to take you a little bit on the journey on that, on how my views on it really changed, and I began to appreciate more why the word cybersecurity might be the right word in this space. And now that it's in my title, my current title and my past title, something that I think is important to talk about how we use these terms and why we use them. So originally, the thing that made me sort of most negative about cyber, I mean, there is this kind of like, well, trying to make it science fiction-y, and the whole thing science fiction-y, not based in reality, part of it. But the reason that the US government started to use the word cyber originally, dating back over a decade now, was that it had to do with parts of the military needing to justify its budget, right, as a lot of these things get driven. This is my own view of how these things developed in talking to and interviewing a lot of people in this space. But about 10 years ago, there was a clear view that the regular military domains, air, land, sea, space, all had cybersecurity issues tied to them, all had security issues, network security issues tied to them of different kinds. But they could only grow their budget so much within each space, and they couldn't unify it together. If they created their own new domain for these kinds of issues, cyber, as they call it, it's a noun in the military, if you talk to people in the military about this, that then they could justify pulling more, working together in a better way, and also increasing the budget in the space. Obviously, that got a lot of defense contractors very interested in the term cyber and cybersecurity, and then people that wanted to sell to defense contractors in this space. And so the term cyber and cybersecurity was already sort of building in this space. But there's a second part of the story that became a lot more evident to me when I entered the government 5 years ago, and that is that not only did the military like the term cybersecurity, but a lot of the human rights people inside the government like the term cybersecurity. And I think that strikes people in a little bit of a strange way, particularly in Silicon Valley. If you talk about it, they think cybersecurity is a crazy word, and they look at you like you have three heads if you say it. But across the country, I think it gets lost a little bit why the human rights people like the word cybersecurity. And if you think about the other terms that we can use, so for NIST we use the term computer security. It's computer security lab, but again, the computer security is sort of limiting, first of all, in the way that you imagine what computer security is, but also in how you define what a computer is, et cetera, and kind of looking at the future of networks, et cetera. You talk about network security, that's not really getting at the information itself. It means something very specific. The internet security ties only directly to the internet, not on private networks. So there are all these limitations there. The one that sort of rings the most true for a lot of people in the human rights space has been information security, or information assurance, as you call it here. But the problem with the word information security in the international context has been that it has been co-opted by China and Russia and other countries. And when they talk about information security, they're really talking about how they secure information within their borders, what we would call censorship, right? So in all of these international discussions, when we're talking about information security, there's kind of this gung-ho for the folks that want us to increase censorship, and that's their number one concern, and they start talking about information security in that space. So the human rights folks started inside the US government and working with other allied governments started to use the term cybersecurity in that space specifically to mean securing the networks, securing computers, securing information across those networks in the way that we would think of security. And that has caught on around the world and has made it easier to have the discussion about what cybersecurity is in a broader context without tying in these ideas of censorship with keeping the idea of the open internet, keeping the idea of open networks. So while there is this tension about using this term cybersecurity, cyber intelligence in this context here, and so many other ways, using the word cybersecurity helped to put forward the idea that you can both have open networks and secure them at the same time, which is so important to academic institutions, so important to the free flow of information, to the economies in this space. So that's where my move from being skeptical of this term cyber and cybersecurity has moved into a gradual understanding that it is helpful to have a term like that out there that can address these kinds of issues. But that does mean that we need to do a good job defining the kind of issues that we have out there. I think it's good in these discussions to start with a threat conversation, and I think that a lot of times We can focus on the specific types of threats, which I'll go into a little bit, but it's also good to talk about who the actors are and why they're doing what they're doing. And I think we can come up with a whole range of examples, and you can come up with a longer list than this as well, of the types of threat actors that are out there, and break them into subcategories, as many people do. But for our purposes here, I've kind of narrowed it down into 3 areas, and I'll just throw out examples that we've seen out there in this space, and I'll go starting with nation states, where we've seen sort of the biggest growth of concern over how they use information. And how they exploit, how nation states are exploiting networks in order to gain information. It can be espionage, it can be other means. One important point here is the administration tried, while I was there, was trying really hard not to use the word cyber attack, which is sort of hard to do because every news story out there uses cyber attack for anything bad that happens anywhere on any network. And so, you see the top headline is cyber attack, blah, 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 blah. So, because it catches people's attention, obviously. But when we use cyber attack, it was very important, at least in the administration's context, to mean something that actually destroyed computers, destroyed networks, where property was damaged. And the reason for that is because if you have an instance where property is damaged, you have to be able to talk about the scale and the scope of that much differently than a situation where a small amount of information was taken, or where service might be denied for a short period of time. Now, obviously, there's a whole spectrum in there between something that actually destroys actual physical property. And something that, and these kind of small attacks. And we're starting to see a lot more of that in how nation states are going into this space and what they are doing in this space. The Director of National Intelligence has said publicly that the main areas of concerns are, the main countries of concern are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea for the United States. You can go through, the news stories. Some of those I can't really go into great detail about who did what, but certainly the U.S. government has said that the Sony incident was something that was perpetrated by a nation state, that we have incidents in the U.S. government. The State Department recently said that a nation state invaded their network and stole their information. We have a whole range of these where it's very clear that nation states are involved. We also have a lot of false flag kind of issues where recently it was reported that there have been some false flags. Bloomberg did a story that was talking about the Russians posing as ISIS in a lot of networks out there, which are interesting stories because attribution is so hard to do in this space. That also gets to a lot of the reasons that sometimes the federal government feels very confident about naming and giving attribution to a specific incident, and sometimes it's a little more careful about it, and it depends specifically about what the intelligence community is seeing out there and how much information they have and how clear they are, because they do not want to play into some of these false flag attribution discussions. So next you have the criminal folks out there. We've all read about Silk Road and the types of information that's traded on Silk Road, but you also have a range of different types of fraud out there, the ransomware, and also some small-time petty stuff to organized crime operating on the internet today in ways that raise lots of concern. And then you have hacktivists, and sometimes the hacktivists do things that I think a lot of people widely support, and sometimes they do things that frustrate people and scare people. I mean, you've seen recently we had one single hacktivist last week claiming to break into the CIA director's personal email account. You have and we have instances where hacktivists broke into Ashley Madison to liberate information, right? And there's a range of different kinds of efforts that they have there. It reminds you a lot of activists in the 60s, et cetera, and how they decided to use information. Some of them were very helpful, some of them were destructive, and you got to make the determination between the two and how to decide when hacking for a cause breaks a line. So this gets us into how do we respond to these different threats, right? I just gave a whole range of examples. I left out some that are bigger in the news, but I mean, there's literally a story a week at this point. My personal view on why we see these growing right now is because the tools to find a lot of these threats are getting better, right? In the past, that's not saying that the number of incidents is staying the same or going down. I actually think the number of incidents is going up in an arithmetic sense, but not an exponential sense. But it seems like an exponential sense because we're doing a better job of actually starting to see these incidents take place. We have better tools today than we used to in the past. Therefore, we can find a lot more of them. And in finding a lot more of them, we start to run into a lot of the kinds of questions about how do we go about responding to these? What are the steps that we need to take? And it seems as though it's getting better, worse, and it's going to continue. We're going to see more and more of these incidents. They're going to seem worse and worse. At some point, we will reach a point where the tools are getting better, and it's making it easier for the defenders than it is for the folks on offense, and that will allow us to turn the tide. And to do that, we have to work coming from the viewpoint that we saw at the National Security Council. We have to work in these 6 different areas. So, number one, as I said before, is the improving risk management standards. We've talked about, even though I think that this, in the long term, this is going to get better, it's never going to go away, right? And it's not just large organizations that need to be concerned, it's every size organization that needs to be concerned at this point. And therefore, management at organizations needs to look at this issue as a risk management issue, right? This is not something that you just do you press a few buttons, you get the new technology out there and your problem is going to be solved tomorrow. You need to figure out how you're going to manage risk long term. And some of that comes into how you go about doing this in a way through best practices, et cetera. We need to have a faster and better response than we've had in the past. As I said, everyone is at risk here, and you start to look at some of the institutions that have been hit recently. While I was still at the White House, there was an incident that has been publicly reported that the Joint Chiefs of Staff email server was down for 2 weeks because of a cyber incident, and they took it offline themselves in order to stop a bigger incident from occurring. If the Joint Chiefs of Staff have to take off their server for 2 weeks to protect themselves, what do other institutions that are being hit by those same actors need to do to protect themselves? Right? You're talking about one of the best protected institutions in the world as far as network security. So I think that's a lesson for folks as to where we're headed in this space, and how much we really need to invest in this space in order to respond quickly, in order to act. Folks should expect that they are going to get hit and that they are going to have to take down networks, et cetera, and do work around responding and figuring out how to address those issues. Third on my list is information sharing. So one way to address some of the threats, the known threats out there, is to get information faster to the edges so that we can get information from one space to other areas in real time, therefore protecting us. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a privacy context later. Fourth is international cooperation. As I was saying at the beginning of this discussion, this really is an international conversation that is going on. How we work together with our allies is extremely important. How we discuss things with our non-allies is important as well. And having those kind of conversations and trying to come up with ways to cooperate and address these issues together is going to benefit everybody and make for stronger networks into the future. Deterrence is an important piece of this as well, and there's been a lot of discussion about deterrence. One thing that we did while I was in the White House was an executive order on sanctions in this space, trying to determine when to bring sanctions against individuals that break norms and against organizations that break norms, and figuring out how to go about doing that. That's one kind of deterrence. There are many other kinds of deterrents that can be brought into play as well, and there's a lot of study right now looking at cyber deterrence in this space and how to make it better. And then lastly is improved R&D. As I said, as we've gotten better technologies in this space, we've started to find more. To me, that's an optimistic view of that. In order to, you have to know the scope of the problem in order to be able to improve. We need more R&D in this space to continue to improve and to defend at a faster rate than the offensive tools move forward, which is a tough task. Now, I talked a little bit at the beginning about risk management standards, and I wanted to go into a little bit of detail about what I mean in terms of risk management standards. When we put together this cybersecurity framework, there are a lot of other efforts that have tried to do this. There's a major ISO standard out there that tries to get at cybersecurity efforts. There are a number of sectoral efforts around cybersecurity. But prior to the cybersecurity framework, there was never a way of uniting these in something that worked across a lot of different sectors using the same terminology. Ajay Banga, the CEO of MasterCard at the White House Cybersecurity Summit, called the cybersecurity framework the Rosetta Stone for cybersecurity. And that really is the intent, that we can translate between different sectors. It's not meant to be an actionable document in and of itself, but it's supposed to help people create new actionable documents, new actionable efforts within their organizations and within their industries to be able to look at the controls that are out there. And breaks those controls into these 5 different categories: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And let me just give some examples in each of these areas, because I think that for identify, it's really important. If you're going to be able to protect your networks, you have to know what the networks are, what information is there, how that information flows, et cetera, so that when something happens, you can identify where it is and how best to protect it into the future. You can't protect something if you don't know where it is, in basic parlance. 2 is protect, so that's the kind of the most obvious one in this space. How do you go about, what kind of rules do you and controls do you put in place to take actual steps to protect the information? Detection is, how do you know when something's on your network and what do you do about it? Responding is, as I was saying before, the response plan, make sure that you know how to do things. And then recovering very quickly is a key point. As we know incidents are going to happen, how do you get set up in order to recover very quickly? So I've been asked a lot of times while I was in government what I thought the top controls were. I sort of deferred to others to make those determinations, but I think since now I am out, I can actually give my viewpoints in a little bit more detail. I think, number one, as I was saying before, I'm going to go through a list of 8 of these just quickly of what I think the top controls and if that folks should look at are and why. Number one is doing this kind of risk management assessment that I was saying before. What of your systems out there need protection? How do you prioritize within your organization of what's most important? McGeorge Bundy, who was National Security Advisor in the 60s, used to say, if we protect all of our diamonds and our toothbrushes in an equal sort of way, we're going to end up with a lot less diamonds and a lot more toothbrushes, right? And the same holds for network security in this space today. We need to figure out where the diamonds are out there, what we need to protect most, and how to go about protecting there. Number 2 on my list is moving beyond the password. So we talk about multi-factor authentication a lot of times. The key here is that we need to figure out ways to get beyond the password. I counted up before I left the number of passwords, unique username and passwords that I was supposed to have when I was inside the federal government, just for my daily work. So this is just HR, logging onto systems, etc. And there were 26 different passwords that I was supposed to keep in my head, all had different rules to them. Most of them had to be over 10 characters with upper and lowercase letters and numbers and symbols, right? Now, there's only 2 rational ways to deal with that as a person, with 26 passwords. One of them is to use the same password everywhere, which is clearly the worst security practice that you could possibly have, but that's one of the options. The other option, which most people, we hope, do rather than put their same password everywhere, is to write them down somewhere, right? Which you're not supposed to do, because it's a terrible security practice. But unless you have a photographic memory, and even people with photographic memories, that do the kind of memory house thing where they wander through the memory house, it takes a long time to get to that 26th password a lot of times when you haven't used it in 2 or 3 weeks, right? So, and so oftentimes to log into some of these systems, you don't have that kind of time. So it is the other rational thing that you do is you write them down. We know that those are bad security practices, but yet we continue to rely on username passwords to this day in almost every system out there. And if you talk to engineers about why, they will tell you because it's the easiest security method to put into place. At some point, we have to get past the fact and make it easier to use other kinds of security methods and put those into place as well. Obviously, people don't love the one-time password, right? Where you have an app that gives you a new generating number that regenerates every 90 seconds, but that's a lot more secure than the kind of systems that we have in place with using lots of different complex username and passwords that you have today. People don't love having smart cards out there and different kinds of smart cards, but again, a lot more secure than things that are regularly used in username and password today. So we have to figure out ways to move beyond. We had a lot of efforts to move this forward inside the US government, the biggest one being NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, which was designed to be something that could be done in a privacy-friendly way. How do you don't end up with a single password with a single set of controls, but you have a federated set of controls that individuals still have a lot of control over. Number 3 on my list is something that seems like it should be pretty obvious, but in my experience in the government and out of the government, seems still not to be in place today, which is timely patching, right? If we know that somewhere between 75 and 90, depending on what industry you're in, percent of incidents are based on existing known threats, right? Known incidents, then patching is the number one best way to protect your systems. Yet we still hear about people that are manually patching, that have not patched major flaws within systems that are known to have flaws within them today, known vulnerabilities. How do you go about solving these problems if you can't get the patches in place that everyone knows will address and solve your problems? That's the number 3. Number 4 is segmenting networks, right? So we want to move more and more to get information at our disposal, easier to grasp, et cetera. But as we do that, we've seen so many networks where it's so easy to move laterally. The scariest one of these is the Target hack. Does anyone know? I'm sure someone here's got to know. How did they get in to Target's payment systems? What route did they take in? Yep, that's right, the air conditioning vendor. They hacked the air conditioning vendor through a known watering hole, got into the network through the air conditioning vendor, worked their way laterally across the network to the payment systems, and then were able to steal all the credit cards from the payment systems, right? That is not a segmented network at that point, right? And that's what I'm talking about in terms of how do you go about breaking these things across. Now, obviously, again, you want to be able to make a network where you have the information available at your disposal, but you need to be able to do it in a way that really segments out the network. Next, response planning. So this is number 5 on the list. So as I was saying before, everyone's going to have incidents. And you should expect to have incidents. That means you need to have a response plan in place. What are you going to do when the incident comes to you? What are you going to do if it's a denial of service attack? What are you going to do if personal information is taken? What are you going to do if a major system is actually destroyed or broken? How do you go about making these efforts? Now, obviously, this goes beyond cybersecurity into more broad risk management, into weather efforts, weather issues, systems being down for other reasons. But in general, we do not do good enough job in this environment, knowing that we have these concerns, to address risk planning in advance. It's not exciting when you're doing a risk response plan and you're doing the exercise, but I'll tell you, it's a lot better to have that in place when the incident actually happens, because I've seen what happens when you do not have a response plan in place and people do not know what to do, and they're running around with like chickens with their heads cut off, and everyone's doing the same job, et cetera. So knowing in advance how to address these concerns is the way to go, and response planning is the way to do it. And there's a lot of literature out there to do it yourself. There are a lot of contractors out there you can hire to help you do it in this space as well. Number 6 is continuous monitoring, and this starts to get into some of the other issues out there about getting information to the right place that you need it. Continuous monitoring checks your controls and makes sure that you are looking for the vulnerabilities, for known vulnerabilities out there across the whole network, so that you're continually making sure that you're patched in the right way, that you have the information you need to monitor your networks. A lot of tools out there to do that today, and that is important. Number 7 is backups, and making sure you run your backups the right way and properly. And we've seen in a case like the Saudi Aramco case, where it's been reported that nation state attacked Saudi oil company, knocked them offline, but it was really only their business units that were offline. And the reason that they were offline for 2 months was because their backups just didn't work. They did not run their backups the right way in order to make sure that their business systems could be turned back on when things happen. And lastly is threat intelligence, and getting information to where it needs to be, knowing that you have the information about the types of things that are going to affect your network. And that goes to improving information sharing. So a lot of the discussion right now in Washington, D.C. is about building information sharing liability protection for companies that want to share information both among themselves and with the federal government and with other government agencies. And there's a bill on the floor of the Senate right now. It's going to be voted on next week, called CISA, CISA, and the focus of that bill is on cybersecurity information sharing, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. That bill has been very controversial in this space. It's the successor of another bill that was called CISPA, which was a House bill at the time, that the White House threatened to veto. And there's a reason that the White House has sort of changed its viewpoint from wanting to veto CISPA and being somewhat supportive of CISA. And I wanted to just briefly go over that, because I do think that it gets at this idea of how you look at doing cybersecurity at the same time you're protecting rights and liberties. So the White House took the viewpoint that under CISPA, that it was lacking 3 major things. Number 1, and all had to do with privacy and rights and liberties in some way. So number 1 was minimization of information. That the information coming in from companies into the federal government in particular was not being done in a way that would make sure that you were getting the right information to the right place. It could go in, originally when CISPA was written, it could go into any agency in the federal government. The companies didn't have to minimize that information when it came in, so that it could be any type of information. So you could have a lot of personal information involved in that. They could literally dump the whole contents of a computer in, and it could gain liability protection for dumping the entire content of the computer in if that's what they needed to do. You didn't have minimization on the government side, right? That there was no call for the government to minimize that information. Number 2 was concern about the militarization of the internet, that this information in the original CISPA bill was almost encouraged to go to NSA. in particular. And this was before the NSA revelations from the Snowden leaks, but the White House had a lot of concerns about the oversight and how you go about doing oversight if that information is flowing to NSA, which is by its nature a secretive organization, which has questions about how you can do public oversight for such type of organization. Therefore, the administration was pushing to get this information flow to go through the Department of Homeland Security so it can get to the right place at the right time. And lastly, the last concern was about liability and liability protection, which is the main goal of this bill, right? But if you make it too broad and folks get liability for just sharing the information, then what steps do they need to take to protect their own networks, right? If you get liability protection simply for sharing information with the federal government, how do we make sure that an energy company is not just going to start sharing information and then have the reverse incentive to actually take the steps to harden up their network, for example? So that gives kind of a broad outline of what was wrong with CISPA. CISA took a different approach. It's still sort of convoluted in how it gets, how they share information under CISA. But I think some of the keys are, there is this central portal for DHS to get the information. The information goes through DHS. The information is minimized as it comes in from the private sector. The private sector is expected to minimize it. And that's what this example here is supposed to be showing, is if you can take the information flows that you have, break them down into certain types of information, and then minimize it directly to the threat at hand, which Department of Homeland Security actually has already done in some ways. Then you know that you're getting the right information in the right place at the right time. That's not to say that there's no personal information involved in that, but the personal information becomes very, very limited, and we'll all know what it is and how it's overseen, right? That's the key. And on the other side of this, right, you have the concern that if you don't have these rules in place, if there's no guidance that's supposed to be put in place, how is that information going to come in when it goes to other parts of the government today? So the question is, how do we make sure, how can we come up with voluntary ways to share that indeed end up coming up with better rules for privacy than what we have today across the federal government? That's something that we worked on through executive order on the side of the administration, but it's something that also could be advanced through this kind of legislation. And lastly is liability. And liability, I think, still remains a huge issue in the House bill, but in the Senate bill, the CISA bill, they've very much narrowed the scope of liability to make sure that you have that we have greater protections in place. And this is important. I go down to this level of detail in this bill because I think it's important for the discussion in this space moving forward. This is the bill that's, again, right now in front of the Senate. It is the one bill that Congress has taken up this year on cybersecurity. And a lot of the discussion has been about information sharing. In fact, it's sort of sucked out the discussion on a lot of other issues that would be good to move forward. The administration has supported the information sharing legislation and thinks that it's important to move forward. And it's going to be a key piece of legislation when it passes and comes into place. And it's important to get it right, and having folks in the community that are thoughtful help to craft it in a way and look at these amendments, especially as it moves to conference with the House bills that have already passed, is going to be a key point to making sure that it can be done in a way that is helpful moving forward to address these broader concerns. So with that, I'm going to open things up to questions. I don't know if this, we'll leave it as a blank screen so I can walk across, but folks have things to ask. Someone's making their way out over here. I think there are 2 mics here, I've been told, so. Yeah.
So this may not be a fair question given you're no longer in government, but you're the closest person around who was, so.
Ask Governor Snyder, he's coming.
Currently, the position of the administration, most of its leaders, is that the security industry needs to start building into its various products some way for the government to be able to get past encryption and things like this. I think it's also a fair statement that outside of government, you're not going to find a single credible security expert who believes this can be done securely. I'm curious, if you were defending the current position of the administration, how you would respond to to those concerns. And I assume if you were still there, you probably would be one of the people who would be expecting
So
to defend.
I think we can talk about this more on the panel that's coming up next, especially with Alex Halderman here, who's a great person to have this conversation with, and David Sobel, I know, probably has some views on this as well. But just to give a very quick answer on it now and go into more detail on it later, I think you have to separate out the things that the FBI director has said from the things that the rest of the administration has said. And I'm serious about that. I mean, the FBI thinks of themselves as being an independent organization. They report to the president, but until the president takes a strong position on something, they're working within the constructs of what has been said, right? So, and I don't think that it's fair to suggest, as many have, right, that the administration has taken a strong position saying that we should build backdoors into technology. That has not, there's no one in the administration that has taken that view. In fact, the president, if you go to the Recode interview that the president did in February, the president very clearly said there is no reason not to have strong encryption built into products today. We must have strong encryption to move forward, right? That's certainly the view there. Now, I think there is also a view of what is it going to mean once strong encryption is built into products for law enforcement, right? And what tools do they have to address that? Or for the national security folks, what tools do they have to address that? That's a conversation worth having, but that is not to put limits or to say that we must build backdoors into systems today. So that's, I mean, we'll see where the administration ends up coming out on this, because again, until someone else takes a point of view, I'm not convinced that that's the administration's viewpoint.
Hi, I'm Jeff Tomaszewski from University of Michigan. My question is about the controls that you highlighted as the most important, the classification and the two-factor and so forth. How did you determine those controls as being the most important? Was it?
So that's a good question, because I didn't talk about that. But my view comes simply from the incidents that I've seen and that we've had to deal with in the federal government. So a lot of those are specifically federal government incidents, but it's also working with private sector companies for how they go about responding. But it's the things that you just see again and again. So, and you know, some of those are designed around, you know, you see 90% of incidents are based on, depending, again, as I said before, depending on what sector you're in, are based on known vulnerabilities. So the question is, how do you go about addressing known vulnerabilities out there? Now, you're still going to have 0 days out there, but if we can focus our efforts and put these controls in place and then have a little bit better idea on the threat intelligence side than the last control I had, then we're going to be able to respond to 0 days better. And that's part of the response planning too, is then you're going to have to be able to respond in that way too. You know, I send you back to the cybersecurity framework and say you should implement the cybersecurity framework in a way that works for your organization, right? The way that the cybersecurity framework is supposed to work is you set a baseline for where you are today and then where you want to get to. And you give yourself ratings based on your internal ratings and based on the industry at large of where you are, where you think you are, and where you want to get to. And then you put controls in place to get there, right? And I was simply giving my view of where I would start if I was starting from scratch as a CISO at a new organization and how to focus those efforts. All those controls are out there.
Thank you.
Hi, Edward Vilmetti. The internet of the past was full of big, expensive machines that had professional staff managing them, and they were expensive. And as costs of computing have come down, we've seen the Internet of Things appear. $10 devices that can go online, $15 devices that have a password embedded in them or some sort of security credentials. And I'm wondering how you reconcile this sort of expensive approach to network security architecture in a world where if someone takes over your Fitbit, you know, they can materially impact your network, or if they break into your refrigerator, they can steal your Gmail credentials, or if they break into your HVAC system or your whatever. Like, how does that change the world? Because I think it's got to change it substantially, because the costs have come down by several orders of magnitude.
That's an incredibly important question, and I can't stress enough how many people are sort of thinking about that issue right now. I don't think we're quite at the point right now where every light bulb you plug in is smart enough to break into the system. But we're going to get there. It's not that far away. So there's two sides to that. So one of them is, how much do we expect that every organization should run its own security systems, should have its own operations center, should have, how large of an organization do you need to be to have a large security staff, and to make these determinations. In some ways, if you run to a more managed security systems in this space, we will get the networks to scale better for when everything is networked as well. The other piece of this is protections in the supply chain, right? Before when we talked about supply chain protections, it was simply about manufacturing, but now it's basically everything you do has some sort of supply chain aspect to it. And so therefore, the standards for how you go about doing assurance in the supply chain become a lot more important in a Internet of Things world. And figuring out the answers to those questions that we've been struggling with for a long time is going to become a lot more important. I know there are a lot of people working on this. Underwriters Labs has been working on it has been putting forward standards now, or is working in the middle of working on standards for health devices, for medical devices, and for control systems, which is a start. But then you start to think about cars and climate control, et cetera, things as being the next phase on this, and so on, and how we go about setting up some kind of systematic way of having assurance in the supply chain for these smaller devices than we haven't had in the past, and how networks work with them is going to be important going into the future. So, Don Blumenthal, good to see you.
Same. Welcome to Ann Arbor. Well, I'm another ex-Fed, and that's how I know Ari. I was with the U.S. Federal Trade Commission in D.C., where we went after the folks who got hacked, not the folks who were hacking. It's an interesting place to be. And going back to my FTC background, I want to suggest that while this crowd is certainly more sophisticated when it comes to security, not everybody here is in systems development or systems architecture, but I think anybody has a place in pushing cybersecurity, because arguably some improvements have been made because of consumer demand. Google went to secure email because of outside pressure, not themselves. If you have an online storefront, and your ISP isn't giving you what you need in the way of security, I'll throw out a buzzword, DNSSEC, go someplace else and make sure your existing provider knows that's why you made the change. So there's a place for increased cybersecurity even on the user, the consumer, whatever side, as well as the architecture side.
I think that's true, and the problem is, in terms of that, from what we've seen, there is some reliance on the ability to have good user interfaces and good user experiences in order to have those in order to have those things take off, right? Using a HTTPS connection is as easy as it gets, right, for the user, right? All you do is you type something in and it switches over and defaults to it. Using encrypted mail is a lot harder today, right? And no one seems to be able to break this kind of tension about how to make using encrypted mail a lot easier for the average user. I think people would use it if it was really as easy to use as HTTPS, but we just haven't gotten to that point. So while I agree with you, I also think that there is still it's not quite as easy as that gets. I often compare privacy in this space to recycling, and when I was in college, and the people that lived in the apartment upstairs from me were big were big environmentalists, and they used to separate out their garbage and keep all the cans and all the newspapers in a room, and there was a room dedicated to recycling in their house, and it smelled really bad, and it was, they had to then take all that stuff, rent a truck, take all that stuff to the recycling center and drop it off in the recycling center. And it was time intensive and it took a long time. I didn't do that, even though I believed in environmental causes because of all the downside cost to it. But when they had curbside recycling, I did it all the time. And now that you can mix stuff together and just bring it to the curb, I recycle everything, right? So when it was made easy for me, I did it. I think that's the way most people are with privacy and security in the space as well. So I think that's what we have to focus on on the consumer side is what can be done in an easy way so that you don't have 26 passwords that then you have these basically two options with that things are easy to use, that you don't have to use PGP the way that it is today in order to encrypt your mail, right? So that's the situation. So last question.
Earlier, I think you mentioned it was the Joint Chiefs of Staff email server was down for a couple of weeks as the result of a cyber attack, and you said that this was one of the most secure email servers. Yet at the same time, we have the recent OPM breach and other things like that, which leads me skeptical to the claim that it actually is one of the most secure servers. And if it is, why can't we share this sort of security
I didn't say
policy
that
with
it was one of the most
government?
secure email services. It was one of the most secure networks, and they had the best resources to protect themselves
sort of
for the Joint
right?
Chiefs of Staff. And I would put OPM in a different category. And here is a distinction on OPM that I think is important. So this is the Office of Personnel Management. Many of you know. There were 22 million records that were taken. Actually, there were two incidents, one which 22 million records were taken, and one in which 4 million records were taken. And there's an overlap among those people, so over 22 million people were affected in the end. The way that we have done protection inside the federal government is sort of based on the way that we've done security in the past. And it assumes that the military, that the Homeland Security agencies, that law enforcement need to get all of the funds and need to update their systems. And therefore, if we do that, we can protect the federal government from incidents. But my experience is that that is not an effective way about going and protecting the systems, because in the information age, a lot of the systems that we have that need to be protected are not held in those agencies. So the Office of Personnel Management is running its systems, is running its database through an 80s mainframe, right? And there's no way you can build enough patches onto an 80s mainframe in order to be able to protect it in a way that is strong enough to address these concerns. They never got they've wanted to upgrade it, they've never gotten the money to do so. And then, to make matters worse, right, from my perspective inside the government, having worked on this particular case and looked into it, the administrator that then goes and looks into the problem and says, we need to make sure that we're secure, et cetera, and gets the system and tools into place in order to be able to find when they've been hacked, right? Gets a CIO on board that actually knows what she's doing, starts to look at these concerns, they get hacked, and then Congress drags her up and now she was not the greatest witness on this issue, right? It's not her area of expertise, but she's the one who looked into the problem, right? And then she gets fired. What does that tell to the next generation of leaders in government, right? Who want to go into this space and say cybersecurity is worth looking into at these agencies that are not DHS, Department of Defense, or law enforcement, right? It says, and they're not going to get the budget to improve their systems. It says that you have to make this decision about what's going to be worse, if I look and find it, or if I don't look and maybe no one knows, right? That's the decision that they have to make. So I think that's the wrong. We're putting the wrong emphasis in this space. We should be encouraging these other agencies, these smaller agencies that have really important information, to look for problems, to improve their networks, to improve the type of computing that they have, maybe move some of that to some of the better protected agencies, but certainly not have that kind of problem. Now, what I'm talking, so I'm separating out the military there from the Office of Personnel Management, which housed this extremely important database for the whole of government, but it was in a civilian agency that was clearly not protected well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks, and we'll be answering more questions on the panel.